The cold inside the ruined city felt alive, like a creature clawing into men's bones. In the ruins of Stalingrad, General Friedrich Paulus walked through a landscape made of rubble, smoke, and bodies half buried in snow. His Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was starving, trapped, and dying piece by piece. He knew the truth better than anyone. The battle was over. Not in days, not in weeks. It was over now. Yet every morning, orders arrived from Hitler's headquarters demanding the impossible. Hold at all costs. Fight to the last man. Victory is near. Commands written by a leader living in maps and fantasies, while Paulus lived in a city of ghosts. Paulus gathered reports from his officers. Ammunition nearly gone, fuel rationed to thimblefuls, soldiers collapsing from hunger before enemy bullets even reached them. He listened to the coughing of frostbitten men echoing through the stairwells of ruined buildings, heard the distant rumble of Soviet artillery drawing tighter like a steel noose. He knew he should speak the truth to Hitler. We cannot hold. We must break out. But each time he approached the radio operator to request a direct line, a wave of paralyzing fear stopped him. He remembered the men Hitler had removed, humiliated, or executed for questioning orders. He remembered that disloyalty, even when justified, was treated like treason. And so he stepped back, swallowed the truth, and crafted a softer message, that the situation was difficult, that supplies were low, that the breakthrough could succeed if air support increased. That was the lie, not a bold fabrication, but a quiet, deadly softening of reality. He knew the Luftwaffe couldn't supply the Sixth Army. He knew the numbers. He had watched the cargo planes crash in flames, had counted the crates that never arrived. But to tell Hitler that his grand strategy had failed felt like stepping off a cliff, so Paulus chose the safer road, the quieter road, the road of half-truths. And every hour he hesitated, his men paid the price. When Hitler replied, his voice crackled through the radio like ice. Stalingrad will be held, the army will stand firm. Surrender is forbidden. It was a sentence spoken with absolute confidence. Because Paulus had not given him the full truth, Hitler believed the Sixth Army could still fight, because its commander could not bring himself to say it couldn't. That single omission sealed their fate. The Soviet ring closed. Relief attempts failed. Hunger hollowed out the Sixth Army from the inside. Men boiled leather for food. Horses disappeared from the streets, eaten long ago. Still Paulus delayed, trapped between duty and survival, honor and obedience, truth and terror. When he finally gathered the courage to speak plainly, when he finally sent a message saying the Sixth Army could no longer hold, it was too late. Tens of thousands were already beyond saving. Hitler's response came with fury. Stand and die. No retreat, no escape. Paulus stood in the shattered basement of his headquarters, listening to the order, understanding perfectly what had happened. His silence had allowed Hitler to believe the lie. And now there was no turning back. The day the Soviets captured him, Paulus felt no relief, only a crushing guilt. He knew he had made the wrong choice, not because he lacked intelligence or bravery in the traditional sense, but because he feared the wrath of one man more than the destruction of his army. It is a moment historians still debate. Was Paulus cowardly or trapped by an impossible system? Yet inside Stalingrad, among the frozen ruins, the answer felt simpler. A truth untold had cost an army its life, and the sound of that silence would echo long after the city stopped burning. The desert had a way of telling the truth. In North Africa, nothing stayed hidden for long. Not tracks in the sand, not burning wrecks of tanks, not the rising desperation inside an overstretched army. General Erwin Rommel, the desert fox, knew this better than any man alive. He could feel the truth in the shifting wind, in the dust trails on the horizon, in the growing silence on the supply routes. The Afrika Korps was running out of fuel, parts, ammunition, the lifeblood of mechanized war. And yet each time he radioed Berlin, he was expected to paint pictures of momentum, of victory just beyond the next dune. But Rommel wasn't a dreamer. He was a soldier who lived by the cold logic of ground and steel, and the truth he faced was terrifying. His army was bleeding to death, slowly and silently, under a desert sun that burned hotter every dawn. It began with shortages that seemed small at first. A delayed convoy from Italy, a few missing tank engines, an airstrike cutting off a port. But Rommel could see the pattern forming like dark clouds far offshore. By mid-1942, he was sending urgent requests, warning that his supply lines were collapsing, that his men were exhausted, that the British were growing stronger while the Africa Corps was shrinking with every mile. He begged for reinforcements, for fuel, for support that never arrived. Berlin didn't want to hear that the North African campaign, Hitler's favorite sideshow, was at risk. They wanted optimism, triumph, a hero who needed nothing and could push the front forward with sheer will. And so Rommel walked a line sharper than a knife's edge. His reports were honest enough to show concern, but softened just enough to avoid Berlin's wrath. He wrote that his supply situation was strained, not catastrophic, that reinforcements were required, not essential for survival. He concealed the depth of exhaustion in his ranks, men who hadn't slept more than a few hours in days, mechanics who worked until their hands bled, tank crews who drove machines held together with scavenged parts and hope. Rommel believed he could still win if he got what he needed, if Berlin understood the danger, if the high command listened. But Hitler's generals, eager to impress their Führer, filtered the truth even further before it reached him. By the time it landed on Hitler's desk, Rommel's warning sounded like mild inconvenience, not looming disaster. The moment everything cracked came just before the Second Battle of El Alamein. Rommel stood on a ridge overlooking a battlefield, stretching toward the horizon like a giant sheet of sand and death. He knew with absolute clarity that his army wasn't ready. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outsupplied. He sent another urgent message, finally stripped of soft edges. We cannot hold without immediate support. But that message, too, was tempered by those above him before it reached Hitler. They told the Führer that Rommel was simply concerned, not desperate, that a victory was still possible, that the Desert Fox was preparing for another masterpiece. Hitler believed them, and Rommel was ordered to stand and fight. On the night the British barrage began, the earth itself seemed to explode. Artillery lit up the sky like burning stars. The ground shook under the weight of thousands of shells. Rommel knew at that moment that his warnings, even the ones he shouted, had not been enough. His men fought with a determination that bordered on impossible, holding lines with broken tanks and dwindling ammunition. But the tide of war could not be stopped by courage alone. When the Africa Corps finally began its retreat, it wasn't a maneuver, it was an unraveling. A slow collapse across miles of desert, engines failing, fuel draining, hope thinning with each passing hour. When Rommel finally stood before Hitler to explain the defeat, he realized how deep the lie had gone. Hitler looked at him not with anger, but disbelief, as if the war in Africa had betrayed him personally. He had never understood how close to the edge Rommel had been forced to operate, and now the price was being paid in men, machines, and a dream of victory that turned out to be nothing more than a mirage. Rommel walked out of that meeting with a heavy, unspoken truth resting on his shoulders. He was not angry at Hitler's rage. He expected that. He was haunted by something far heavier. He had allowed others to dilute the truth he desperately tried to send. He had been honest, but not loud enough. And in war, a truth whispered can be as fatal as a lie shouted. The desert swallowed the Africa Corps not in a single moment, but in a long chain of small silences, each one tightening around Rommel's army like the slow closing of a noose. The summer of 1943 arrived not with hope, but with a strange, crushing silence on the Eastern Front. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, the Reich needed a miracle, a victory powerful enough to erase the shame and restore the illusion of unstoppable might. And Hitler believed he had found it in a single word: Kursk, a bulging, exposed Soviet front line that looked vulnerable on his maps, like a ripe fruit ready to be cut in half. He wanted an attack so decisive it would turn the course of the war. But the truth on the ground, the truth his generals knew, was far darker than anything drawn in red pencils and sweeping arrows. Generals Walter Model and Erich von Manstein visited the front separately, but what each man saw left the same chilling mark. Soviet defenses were not fragile, they were monstrous. Miles of trenches carved into the earth like the veins of some sleeping giant. minefields thick enough to swallow entire tank battalions, anti-tank guns hidden like coiled snakes, and behind them reserves so deep they seemed endless. Model walked the fields himself, kneeling in the dirt, running his gloved hand across mines exposed by wind. He listened to the distant hammering of Soviet engineers building fortifications day and night. He knew what it meant. The enemy wasn't preparing to retreat. They were waiting. Manstein, brilliant and coldly analytical, arrived at a similar conclusion. He had always advocated for mobile defense, for striking where the Soviets overextended themselves. But Hitler wanted a grand offensive, a final offensive, one that would prove the Wehrmacht was still the finest fighting force on earth. So he demanded one thing from his marshals: assurance, confirmation that the attack could succeed, and he asked it in that clipped, forceful tone that allowed no room for fear, no space for uncertainty. That was the moment the lie began to take shape. It was not a lie told outright. It was a lie built from hesitation, from carefully chosen words that softened the edges of disaster. When Hitler asked Model, "Can your Ninth Army break through?" the general answered that his units were prepared, though he knew their tanks were worn, their crews exhausted, their reconnaissance incomplete. He warned of Soviet defenses, but not with the urgency he felt in his bones. He did not say, "We cannot win." He only implied caution, and caution was something Hitler had long since lost the capacity to hear Manstein behave the same way. He explained his doubts, laid out the risks, but concluded that victory was still possible, especially if new Tiger tanks arrived in time. But he knew the truth. The Tigers were still plagued by breakdowns. Their engines overheated, their tracks snapped, their fuel consumption was catastrophic. Yet to admit that would mean confronting Hitler's wrath, challenging the offensive he had pinned his hopes and his pride upon. So Manstein let the illusion breathe. Behind closed doors, both generals knew the reality. Their armies were not ready. Their units were recovering from the brutal winter battles. Their supply lines were stretched thin. Their Luftwaffe support had declined. And worst of all, Soviet intelligence had already learned of the German plan. Kursk was not a trap for the Soviets. It was a trap for Germany. But the truth had become dangerous. The high command had learned through blood and humiliation that contradicting Hitler only tightened the leash around their necks. And so, step by careful step, Model and Manstein allowed Hitler to believe in a victory that no longer existed. They tried to delay the attack, hoping circumstances would force a cancellation. They emphasized concerns, hoping Hitler might wake from his dream. But they never, in a single moment of courage, said plainly, "This operation will fail." On July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel began with a roar that shook the earth. Tanks advanced in massive columns, engines growling, dust rising behind them like a storm. But within hours, the truth smashed into the Wehrmacht like a hammer. Minefields ripped apart the armored spearheads. Anti-tank guns turned German tanks into burning steel coffins. Soviet aircraft dominated the skies. And as Model watched his Ninth Army grind forward in agony, he felt the weight of the unspoken truth pressing on his chest. His warnings, half-formed and softened, had doomed his men to die in fields they never had a chance of crossing. Manstein's southern attack fared better at first, his elite panzer units carving through Soviet defenses with desperate brilliance. But even his successes collapsed against the sheer depth of Soviet reserves. When the Red Army launched its counteroffensive, the German lines trembled like a glass about to shatter. By the time Hitler called off the operation, the last real hope of a German victory in the East died with it. The Wehrmacht would never again take the initiative. The war had turned, not in a moment of failure, but in a moment of silence. Model and Manstein carried that silence with them. They had tried to warn Hitler, yes, but not loudly enough, not clearly enough, not bravely enough. They had allowed their words to be bent into shapes that suited the fantasy of a man who refused to see reality. And because of that, thousands of German soldiers, fathers, sons, farm boys, machinists, students, were thrown against defenses no army on earth could have broken. History often blames Hitler for Kursk, but the truth buried beneath layers of fear and obedience is more complicated. The lie that doomed the Wehrmacht was not a single statement, it was the absence of a single statement. The one line neither general dared to utter: "We cannot win this battle." By early 1945, Germany no longer resembled a nation at war. It resembled a nation drowning. Cities lay in ruins, railways splintered, fuel reserves drained until tanks became motionless steel shells scattered across muddy fields. Refugees streamed west in endless columns, their footsteps blending with the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. The war was already over, though no one dared say it. And inside Hitler's bunker, a dim, suffocating labyrinth beneath Berlin, a new lie was being born, one that would condemn the last loyal soldiers still fighting to defend a homeland collapsing under its own weight. General Kurt Zeitzler, the Wehrmacht's chief of staff, had once been admired for his energy and sharp mind, but now, under the crushing pressure of Hitler's delusions, he looked like a man haunted by truths he could not speak. Every night he studied maps littered with red arrows pointing toward Berlin, each one representing an entire Soviet army group, advancing with unstoppable momentum. Every morning Hitler demanded the same thing: counterattacks, reserves, new armies. His voice carried not authority, but desperation, the tone of a gambler who had lost everything yet still believed one more roll of the dice could save him. But there were no more dice to roll. Zeitzler knew it. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's armored warfare, knew it. They had toured the shattered front lines, seen units that existed only on paper, divisions that had fewer rifles than soldiers, Volkssturm teenagers shaking with fear as they clutched rusted weapons that jammed in the cold. They tried to explain that the army group Vistula, created by Hitler's command, was a ghost, under-equipped, under-trained, and led by men chosen for loyalty rather than competence. They described bridges destroyed, fuel depots burned, rail lines severed. They pleaded for a strategic withdrawal, a chance to save lives by shortening the fronts and surrendering untenable positions. But Hitler refused. Retreat was treason, reality was negotiable, and so he demanded proof that his fantasies still had breath. That pressure forced Zeitzler and Guderian into a terrible compromise. When Hitler asked, "How many reserves can you send to stop the Soviets at the Oder River?" they did not answer with the devastating truth. None. Instead, they spoke of mobilizing units, redirecting formations, and reorganizing divisions. They hoped these words would soften the blow, buy time, create space for decisions that might save civilian lives. But Hitler heard something else entirely, that an army still existed, that salvation was still possible, that Berlin could still be held. The illusion grew with each passing day, and Hitler clung to it like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. And then came the breaking point, the moment when the lie could no longer be twisted, stretched, or disguised. Soviet Marshal Zhukov and General Konev unleashed their final offensives toward Berlin with a violence that shook the earth. The Oder front collapsed almost instantly. Entire German divisions disintegrated in hours. Reports poured in describing Soviet tanks rolling across frozen fields like black waves swallowing everything in their path. Zeitzler carried these reports into the bunker, his hands trembling as he placed them in front of Hitler. Hitler swept the papers aside, insisting it was all exaggerated. "Where are the reserves?" he demanded. "Where are the counterattacks? Where are the divisions you promised?" Zeitzler had no answer. In that moment, he felt something inside him break, a realization that the lie he had allowed to grow had now become a noose tightening around the last remnants of the German army. He finally said the words he feared most: "There are no reserves." Hitler exploded in fury, accusing him of betrayal, incompetence, defeatism, but the truth was beyond fury now. It was irreversible. That night, Zeitzler walked out of the bunker a hollow, shattered man. He resigned shortly afterward, retreating into isolation as Berlin fell around him. Guderian followed the same path, dismissed after repeatedly clashing with Hitler over the hopelessness of the situation. Their final reports, their late, desperate honesty, came far too late to save the tens of thousands still fighting in the ruins of the capital. Hitler continued to believe that phantom divisions would appear, that armies still existed just beyond the horizon, but they were illusions created from silence, hesitation, and the fear of speaking a truth that should have been spoken months earlier. When Soviet troops finally entered Berlin, they found children defending street corners, veterans fighting with empty rifles, and exhausted soldiers who had never even seen a proper supply line. The promised reinforcements never came, because they had never existed at all. The last lie told to Hitler was not one of ambition or arrogance, it was one of mercy, a mercy that cost countless lives.